Peter, you are about to publish the study about the Russian propaganda and informational warfare. So what is new on that? What is special about that?
So, I mean, the study is called The Kremlin's Weaponization of Information, Culture, and Money. What the Kremlin's done, it's sort of redefined the rules of propaganda and influence abroad. And it's really worked out the weaknesses of the Western system and its plays on them. So, I mean, there's three elements, I think, that the Kremlin focuses on. I mean, we all think that information is a neutral thing in many ways, that it's a good thing, that freedom of information is sort of a sacred thing in Western society. It's the First Amendment in America. What the Kremlin has done is taken information and instead of using it as a way to persuade or engage in debate or all the kind of things that we associate information with, it really thinks about it in military terms. So it thinks of information as a way to sabotage, demoralize, blackmail, confuse, break down communication in Western society. So it uses a tool like Russia Today as a weapon, not as a way to convince somebody else. Something similar happens with culture. So we think of cultural exchange as a priori a good thing. So if the Russian Orthodox Church has a role to play in Eastern Europe, we think that's great. All churches should talk to each other and have a fruitful dialogue. Or when Russian NGOs appear in Central Asia, we think that's great. It's good for cultures to talk to each other. But since around 2004, Russia has been thinking about how one uses cultural institutions like the church or cultural NGOs as ways to sort of sow chaos and subvert other societies. A lot of the time this is rationalized by saying this is what the West does to us. Look at all these West NGOs, they're plotting revolution in Russia. And Russia, almost because it's so paranoid, then becomes ahead of the game in being aggressive, because then it really does use its cultural NGOs that way.
But a lot of people would tell that everybody has their own propaganda. The US have, some European countries have, a lot of people all over the world have. What is so special?
Well, look, there's two things I think to think about. The first one is, look, a lot of these techniques that the Kremlin uses, we certainly see them in the West. We've seen them for decades in the West. So we need only to think about the American operation in Guatemala in the early 1950s, when America basically, essentially invented a communist threat in order to cause a coup in Guatemala. But the difference is that, sure, the West uses a lot of these techniques, but they're part of a very large armory of tools. The Kremlin, because it feels itself so much weaker, has kind of concentrated all the covert and dirty techniques, funded them massively, and turned it into the main policy they have. So if one can almost imagine all the worst bits of covert Western influence, and imagine they were just brought together to create one super weapon. That's essentially what the Russians have done. So yeah, we can recognize these techniques everywhere. So that's the first issue. The second issue, I think we have a problem with this word propaganda. Everything is propaganda as one of the Kremlin's kind of ideological weapons. I think we really have to sit down and think about the challenges for the 21st century. Because if in the 20th century the main challenge was the battle for freedom of information, the battle against censorship, now the main battle is going to be the problem of the abuse of freedom of information. So yes, we've always had propaganda, but now contemporary media make these tools much more vicious and much more powerful, and we really have no way of conceptualizing the threat.
In a way, you can't forbid the media. It doesn't matter what they're doing. And this is the way, the totalitarian states used to do, making not allowed to publish the articles or trying to squeeze them. Yeah, so what the way to deal with that?
No, I certainly wouldn't advocate any kind of censorship unless it's maybe a critical military situation like you have in Ukraine, where I think there was a strong argument to switch off some of the Kremlin channels. But generally, no, I think that's completely unnecessary. And that almost plays into the Kremlin's game because it's trying to cause conflict here. No, I think we need, it's a case of finding the right analytical tools and then the right instruments with with which to self-regulate media. So, for example, it's not that complicated. I think one has to develop, I think the main TV channels like Al Jazeera, the BBC, etc., they need to sit down and almost develop a charter of sort of behavior which they say defines them as media, and behavior which doesn't. So it's fine having differences of opinion. It's not fine to use an information channel for disinformation, which is what Russia Today does. It just lies, and it thinks it's fine to lie. So they would almost develop sort of common rules and common practices, and just through peer group pressure then say, look, we're media, we all subscribe to this charter, whatever these guys are, they're not part of our gang. You know, you can watch them if you like, but, you know, they're not part of what we recognize as media. And Russia Today would still have its sort of audience of paranoid schizophrenics, but it wouldn't, the censor would no longer listen to it. Also, I think we need sort of NGOs, a bit like Transparency International, or sort of investigate corruption and become like a marker for corruption. Or human rights NGOs look at human rights issues internationally. We need NGOs which are internationally recognized, which would follow disinformation and would say, like, this channel, they've gone beyond the pale. They get a 1 out of 10. And people would just stop sort of looking at these channels as legitimate sources.
I mean, when you talk about Russia Today, what's your criticism? I mean, when I would speak to the people from Russia Today, they would say, like, yeah, we do have some agenda, but it's still journalism. Why you would prove? What is the difference?
Sure. So, listen, there's absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, officially, Russia Today's position is to give a Russian point of view. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's called public diplomacy. America has Voice of America, which does this. Ukraine doesn't have anything at the moment, which is a big loss. It should have something. I'm actually for more public diplomacy. But that's not what they actually do. They actually say nothing about Russia. They hardly sell Russia at all. They use, Russia Today is used for what used to be called in the Cold War active measures. It's a way of spreading disinformation and lies dressed up as journalism.
I mean, well, everybody remembers what role played Fox News in the US during the Iraqi war.
Not just during the Iraqi war, Fox News.
I mean, and in a lot of other cases.
Yeah, but Fox News generally, and I think some of its behavior is beyond the pale, so this is why exactly you need some sort of self-regulation of this activity. But Fox News basically is sort of classic agitational propaganda. You know, they have a cause and they support it, you know. They believe that sort of republicanism is great, you know, Obama is evil, and they try to prove it. Some of the techniques they use, I think, are beyond the pale. The use of conspiracy theories to undermine, I think, is something that is beyond any kind of behavior. However, Russia Today aren't trying to convince anybody of anything. They're not in the business of persuading. They're in the business of sowing confusion, sowing divisions. They're in the business of sabotage, blackmail. These are completely different mechanisms. They have nothing to do with any kind of journalistic discourse. So we need to start defining what these forms of behavior are.
When you talk that Russia used information as a weapon, what is your example? You know, like, we can generally talk it, but can you explain?
I mean, a very simple example is the MH17 crash, when Russia Today, and Russia Today is not just the TV channel now, you know, it's a huge conglomerate, you know, it's news, it's social media, it's internet. After the MH17 crash, the mission they had was to throw 1 million conspiracy theories out there to kind of, you know, to fog up and confuse the space. This was done completely consciously, so, you know, they started spitting out one conspiracy theory after the next. This wasn't an honest journalistic discussion about the possible causes of the crash. This is a way of sowing confusion and, you know, distracting from other issues. So there, for example, some of their coverage in Syria was very insidious. So they invented a massacre which didn't exist. They invented uses of chemical weapons which didn't exist. There were quite a lot of times when they were just using disinformation. There was absolutely no way they didn't know this.
But what is special about the Ukrainian coverage, besides
their Ukrainian coverage? So there have been some classic ones. So there was an incredible series of reports about threats to the Jewish community in Ukraine, because one of the biggest, you know, lines has been to try to convince the world that fascists have taken power in Ukraine. And there were interviews with sort of representatives of the Jewish community where they completely twisted their words and reversed the meaning. This was done on purpose. I think, you know, you'd immediately say this is the sort of behavior which is not part of journalism. You're not trying to persuade, convince, or anything. This is a Secret Service, operation. So that was a very kind of noticeable moment. There were several programs that they made which used something that linguists call false assurances, so false comparisons. So, for example, there was a program comparing the actions of the Ukrainian government to the genocide in Rwanda. This is completely sort of false logic that was being used. So, any way of regulating the field would have to look at these kind of models of speech, models of discourse.
Sometimes the Ukrainian government tries to spin the stories. Sometimes they give in the wrong information about what's happening on the ground. They're not talking enough about the civilians, which might be killed by the Ukrainian troops. And probably there are some ultranationalists who are in the parliament and probably would run for the parliament.
Well, governments lie all the time. We're not talking about governments. We're talking about something which says it's a media that deals in information. So governments, I assume, lie all the time. I think that's just a sine qua non of journalism. So listen, yes, any kind of media should be sensitive to those sort of things. But listen, something could say that it's public diplomacy, that it's not really a journalistic body, that its mission is to explain government policy publicly. That's kind of what Voice of America will increasingly might start to do in America. It's changed its charter a little bit. So, but there's nothing wrong with that. As long as you're doing this, you're not lying. Your role is to explain government policy. That's what you say, what you are, and that's fine. Then you should be sort of defined as a public diplomacy channel. That's fine. I mean, this is a legitimate form of communication. You should just say what it is.
But why the West should care?
So it's a very good question, because this really gets into the question of what is the relevance of Russia. My sense is that we need to stop thinking about Russia as kind of a freakish problem, because then we always get into this debate about a new Cold War, not a new Cold War. I don't think that categorizes Russia in the right way. What the present Russian government has done is worked out the weak spots of globalization. We haven't talked about money enough. They also use money in a very clever way. So when it's almost like an X-ray of the weaknesses in the Western system. So we actually have to start thinking about Russia as a sort of an avant-garde of malevolent globalization. And then it becomes very clear that the issues Russia raises are kind of relevant to our own system. It's about healing our own system rather than thinking about the importance of Russia. And we also have to understand that what Russia is doing now in terms of its sort of misuse of information, misuse of culture, misuse of money, is going to be taken up and is being taken up by other aggressive, rising authoritarian states. These are the challenges, the global challenges for the 21st century. They're not Russia-specific issues. So we have to start developing these institutions and the mental ideas with which to deal with it. Because at the moment we just don't have any. So that's very much my sense. I mean, Russia is giving a sort of perverted globalization, and we have to start getting on top of it.
But why then the world should care about Ukraine? In a way, okay, there is something new there. There is a global challenge. But here you have, actually, for us, it's a big country. It's our country. But in a way, the trouble is all over the world.
Well, the reason I find Ukraine exciting is because it's a country that is going through a search for a new form of politics, a new form of government before our very eyes. I mean, politics in the West is sort of finished in the sense that there's a sort of politics seems to happen on autopilot in the West. The only political movements with any sort of energy at the moment are largely far-right movements, very sadly. Ukraine right now is full of a whole generation of people looking for new political models, looking for utopias. And that's incredibly invigorating and refreshing. So I think Ukraine matters almost like the place where the future of politics is being experimented with and defined and seen whether it's possible. It's the place at the moment where we're seeing whether democracy can still work in the 21st century.
But there would be those here who are very concerned that, you have the battalion commanders coming to the parliament just because they're very popular on Facebook.
Yes, exactly. So let's look at it. Let's start looking at what's going on in Ukraine. It's the crucible of experimentation for the 21st century. That's why it's so exciting. It's dangerous. It's scary. That's what makes it interesting.
I mean, it can be something old-time populism, just in a new social media way.
There's plenty of that. There's something. There's liquid Democrats here. There's new nationalists, old nationalists, romantic nationalists. There's Euro dreamers, anarchists, socialists. There's an incredible sense that politics can be created, and there's a very high risk it'll fail, because the corruption might eat up all this idealism very quickly. But that is what makes it exciting and vivid, and it's sort of the focus of what the future might be. It's the place where we're seeing how the future could form.
I mean, there are a lot of institutions now writing, discussing Russia and Ukraine, and in a way it doesn't lead to something within. There is a feeling here in Ukraine that like there is no anything going on, in fact. But what do you think it's actually, I mean, being realistic, what Ukraine really can expect from the West? What is unrealistic? And to what understanding, to which extent there is like general understanding of the situation here?
There is absolutely no understanding of the situation here.
Why?
In the public space. Well, I exaggerate. Even more important than the lack of understanding, because people who want to understand do understand, is a lack of caring, really. People do care about an aggressive new Russia. They don't, at the moment, care about Ukraine because they have no emotional connection to it. They have no image in their head. They have no kind of instinctive connection to it. So really the challenge for Ukraine and for you is to start to build that sort of emotional bridge. That's the first thing. The second thing, what was the second thing? What's the other thing you want to know?
I'm talking about like what...
what to expect? You mean from governments?
Yeah.
From governments? A lot of words and no action, essentially. Listen, I mean, what we're speaking today, the two most hawkish and proactive ambassadors, foreign ministers, the two most proactive European foreign ministers are leaving or have left their posts. The EU has signalled that it's going to be very soft on Russia by nominating a foreign policy chief whose instincts seem to be, for détente with Moscow. And any sort of détente with Moscow will kind of necessarily mean softening support for Ukraine. So there'll be a lot of words, very little action, and a lot of praying. I think despite the language, the 450 billion of trade with Russia is such a big, immovable fact that will actually guide most policy making. So you're kind of on your own.